Well, hello everyone and welcome back to Quilt 101, our beginner quilting series. Today is lesson 7 and here's my little buddy with me. He's feeling very clingy today. It's chilly. He's feeling very clingy, so he's going to be in our video today. So if you recall, in the last lesson, we put our entire quilt top together, and if you can see behind me is our 3x3 spread of our blocks, which is the same that we're doing inside of our book. And then we also have our 3x4 spread, which is underneath. So we're going to put 2 borders on today. And I'm going to show you how we're going to measure and cut for those border strips, which we did not do prior, and there is a reason. And we're also going to put a border on the 3x4 quilt because it's going to go on just slightly differently. So if you're ready to put the borders on your quilt top, well, let's get to it. All right, so let's read the instructions for our quilt pattern so we know what to do next. All right, here is our book, and we're back for our the last little bit that we need to cut. And so our strips in this book, we already talked last lesson about our 4-inch 4x4 squares, which were from the same print as the sashing, which I have cut from both quilts. And then the last fabric we need to cut is fabric E. Our fabric E is going to be our border strips. And in the book, it says to cut 4 strips that are 4.5 by 40.5. Now, I did not have you do this because every time we sew blocks together, we can change the size of the outside of the quilt. So again, going back to how our sizes of our blocks can vary a little bit, which is why we didn't cut our sashing until we were ready to put the quilt together, and we needed our sashing. And that's the same thing with our border. So in order to prevent any kind of rippling or uneven, unsquare types of borders, which can look really awful, we're going to go ahead and measure through the quilt, and we're going to do it in a very particular way, and that'll make sure that our borders are exactly sized. So we did not cut any of our border strips in advance, and I don't expect anyone to cut any of their border strips in advance. What we're going to do is use the measuring technique that I'm about to teach you to go ahead and cut those. And then if we look here, also in fabric E, we have, Pat says to cut 6 strips that are 2.25 by 42. We didn't do that either. And those strips are going to wind up being our binding strips. She says to cut 2.25. And that's kind of a controversial topic. Some of us cut our strips at 2.5 and some at 2.25. I am fine at following the 2.25 rule. I think if you have a border that's cut at 2.5 and you sew it on with 1/4 inch seam allowance, it winds up being a little bigger on the back than it is on the front. Some people like to not have it look like that, but we are not going to cut anything in advance because I'm going to teach you a little trick on figuring out the binding too while we're at it. And then the reason we did the binding, or that she asked to do the binding the same as the border print, is a lot of times it makes things look a little bit neater if your binding is the same color as your border print. And it hides sort of a world of imperfections, but you don't have to do it that way. And in the case of our 3x4 quilt top, we may not do it that way because there isn't enough or there may not be enough fabric to make that happen. And that binding is all the way at lesson 10. So we're only on lesson 7. We're going to stick with what we're doing today. Okay, so to cut our borders and to make our borders attached to the quilt in the proper way, we're going to actually measure through the quilt, and we're going to do that 3 times. To get a proper measurement of the quilt, we do not want to measure from each of the sides. So let me explain. So as we're putting on our sashing and our border print, when we go to make things fit, sometimes we ease a little on this direction and we ease a little in that direction. These are all already in the seam, and then we have this one side here that's not in the seam. And what happens sometimes with the sides of the quilt, and the tops and the bottom, is they tend to like want to shrink in a little bit. So oftentimes, if we were to measure just the side of the quilt, we would come up with a completely different measurement than we would if we measured through the center. So to avoid from cutting our strips in the wrong length, we're going to go ahead and measure 3 times through the center of the quilt. So let me show you that. So if you've been following the channel and you've watched any of these full quilt tutorials like the fair and square quilt, you'll have seen this method before. What we're going to do is we're going to take a measurement through the dead center of the quilt, and then we're going to measure about 1/3 of the way in on both sides. So we're just measuring 3 times through the quilt, and we're going to make a note on what those measurements are. So in order to get the quilt, the top and the bottom borders on, we're going to measure through the center on the width. And I will tell you, just as a side note, with this quilt in 3x3 blocks, in theory, so our 12, 12, and 12 is the 36 inch. And then we have 2 inches here, 38, 2 inches here that are at 40, plus our 1/2 inch seam allowance. So in measurement, right, if we were to add it up in math, that 40.5 measurement would be exactly right. And if fabrics are generally somewhere between 40 and 45 inches wide on our quilting cottons, that would mean that for the width of this quilt, we only need 2 strips. We need 1 strip for the top and 1 strip for the bottom, because we can cut a full strip selvage to selvage and it will fit. We should have enough fabric to make it all the way from one side of the quilt to the other. Now, that won't be the case with this quilt right here, because this quilt is a 3x4. So I know that the width of this may work with 1 strip, but the length of it is going to require multiple strips. So if we keep our quilt relatively square, then we can cut the top border and the bottom border out of 1 strip each. And if that then means that the top and the bottom of the quilt, by adding that border, will add 8 inches to the length. So then if we were just adding a border to the sides, we couldn't get it out of 1 strip. We would have to add 2 strips together. But if we add a cornerstone, which is what we're going to do to this quilt, then the cornerstone takes up the measurement of the top border and the bottom border. And then we can add the same size border to the sides. That's the theory. So in order to put a border all the way around this quilt, we need 4 cornerstones and 4 strips that are 4.5 inches wide, right? So the key then is to only figure out what the length is going to be. But if you're doing a border without cornerstones, then you would have to add that length, and you would then need to remeasure through the quilt, and obviously you're going to have to put 2 strips together. So let's go ahead and measure through the center of the quilt so that we can figure out what size we're going to cut these strips. So I'm going to take my tape measure, set it on one side of the quilt, measure to the other side, and this measurement right here is 39 3/4. Okay? It isn't 40 and it's not 40.5. It's 39 3/4. So I've gone right through the center. So now I'm going to go up here. That's a little bit further from the center, just right under that block line, and I'm going to measure it again. This measurement is 40.5 inches. That's a really big difference. I'm actually going to measure that middle again. Yep, pretty much. If I just take out all of the slack, it's right at 40 inches. So there's a 1/2 inch difference between the measurement here and the measurement here, right? I mean, 1/2 inch is a good bit. So now I'm going to go down here and I'm going to measure approximately in the same space. Smooth it out a little bit. Right about here. And this measurement is 40 inches. So I have 2 measurements at 40 and 1 measurement at 40.5. How are we going to arrive at the general measurement that we need? Well, we're going to average it out. All right, here we go. I'm going to have my calculator. So I am going to add the 3 numbers together. 40 and 40 are 2 of the measurements, and then I got another measurement at 40.5. I'm going to add the 3 of those together, and because there's 3 measurements, I'm going to divide by 3. So I'm pretty close to 40 and 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my strips to 40 and 1/8 of an inch. And that way I can ease the top in and ease the bottom in. It'll help that quilt be square. So let's go ahead and cut those strips. And we have our strips here of our butterfly fabric that we chose in the beginning. And I just want to lay them down selvage to selvage. Again, we already tested the measurement on our mat. So I'm going to turn my strip this time with the selvages on the right hand side, and I want to start the measurement with my fold at the 1 or at the 0 mark. And I'm going to lay this squarely down on the line, and then I'm actually going to cut this strip to half the measurement that I need. So I know when I open it up on the fold, I'll have exactly the measurement I need. So I needed 40 and 1/8, so I'm going to cut this to 20 and 1/16, and I'm just going to go right in between the edge of the ruler and the 1/8 inch mark there, and that's how I'm going to cut my strip. And I'm going to cut 2 of these because I'm going to need one for the top. Oops. One for the top and one for the bottom. Hence, there are the edges of my selvages that I'm going to toss. I'm going to do the same thing to one more strip. So the ones with the selvages are going to go up here so they're out of the way, and we're going to do it this way. So in the opposite of what we would normally do, which is measure from our selvage, we're going to measure from the fold, and I'm going to go down the mat. And again, you're going to want to test your mat and make sure that it's the right measurement. Otherwise, you're going to have to do some marking here. And I'm going to go down the strip to the 20 and 1/8 mark, which is just past, that's half of the measurement I need because I'm on the fold. And we'll just cut that off. Okay. All right, we're going to add our strips to the top and the bottom of our quilt. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to pin so that you can ease these strips into place. Okay, here is the top of our quilt. I'm lucky it fits right here on the camera. Here is my first border strip that I'm going to put on the top. All right, you can really see the colors now that are working at play. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by pinning right here at the corner. I'm going to pin this border piece flush with the edge of the quilt. Okay, nice and even and straight, flush with the edge of the quilt. And I'm going to pin right in the corner. Okay, so that takes care of one side of the border. Now I'm going to come all the way to the other side, and I'm going to put my border print flush with this corner and put in a pin. Now we know in one end it's going to be a hair too big, and one end it's going to be a hair too small, and this is already sort of lifting here at the end. So this is the one we're going to have to ease the border onto the quilt. So you see, I don't want to say I'm tugging, but what I'm doing is I'm bringing this taut so I can see what I'm dealing with here with the border. Let me see if I can bring it this way so you can see what happens. So when I bring it taut, it's going to come up towards the edge, and I'm just going to take my fingers, and while holding on to the quilt, I'm going to walk it down, and then I come to the center point, and I'm going to put a pin in the center point. Now what I've done is I've sort of eased this strip on to find the center point. So rather than pushing all the fabric this way to find the center point and having it continue to go to the other side, I actually eased through the center, and that kind of evens out any gapping that we're going to have. And we're not talking about a lot of gapping here, but it is a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing from the middle to the side, just kind of hanging on, trying to pull so that you can see how it kind of fits in. So I'm going to walk my fingers down, and I'm going to pin right here. So now I've eased the center here between the center point and the edge, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And if you have a longer strip, you know, a bigger border, you can keep doing this until you get a good amount of it eased across the quilt. So if this were, let's say, double the size, I might have a pin on each end, one in the middle, and I might have 2 here and 2 here. But in this case, I think that's good enough. And it sort of eases all of that gapping in on one side, okay? And then I'm going to put this under my sewing machine and sew, and I'm going to make sure it's aligned and keep it nice and straight while I'm sewing, and then pull out a pin, and I'm going to do exactly what I did with the sashing strips that you saw on camera, making sure that it's even on the end. I don't want any overhang on the end. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this one, and then I can go ahead and pin onto the bottom. Unless you want to go ahead and pin onto the bottom, I just find sometimes when I'm moving things under the sewing machine that they can get a little out of skew, so I tend to not pin. But we'll just go ahead and pin that again on camera this time so you can see how the pinning works. Because this end might not require any easing at all. So again, I'm going to come up to the border print, put it up against this corner right here and pin it. And then what am I going to do? All the way to the other corner. So let's go down to the other corner. We'll align that corner and we'll pin. Okay. And then I'm going to take the 2 ends, sort of even them out, walk my fingers down to the center point. And I know this is the center point because it's the center square in my quilt. There's my center point. Then these 2 center points, I'm going to walk through here and put down a pin. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Walk down the quilt and put a pin in. And this one really didn't require any easing at all, but if it did, we can handle that, okay? So now I'm going to go sew these 2 border prints, and then we'll come back. Okay, so now I've turned the quilt sideways so we can see our beautiful borders. And because I want to measure again, but you can see here's our beautiful borders over here, top and bottom of the quilt. And so now we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to measure through the center of the quilt. Now, if this quilt were just getting a border on the outside and it wasn't getting any cornerstones, I would measure from this end right here all the way to this end right there, and I would do the same exact method where I measure 3 times through the center. But for this quilt, we have these beautiful cornerstones, and these cornerstones are exactly 4.5 inches, which means they're cut exactly the same size as the border. So I know that what I actually need is the measurement between this seam right here and this seam right here, and I'm going to have to add a 1/2 inch to it because we have a 1/4 inch seam on that side and one on this side. But we can measure from seam to seam. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to get our tape measure again. And I'm going to go exactly where I did the last time, right through the center. And we're going to measure seam to seam. And this time, I'm just going to make sure that I am getting any gaps out of the quilt when I measure. So this seam measures 39 3/4. Okay? 39 3/4. And then I'm going to come up here again. Oops. And I'm going to measure here right about there from the seam all the way over. I'm just making sure there's no gaps in the quilt. And that one measures 39 3/4. So now I've got one more seam or one more measurement over here from this seam. And we're going all the way across. $39 3/4. So that's great. All right, we have 39 3/4. Now remember, that is the measurement from seam to seam. So I have to add a 1/2 inch to that. So it's 40 1/4. 40 1/4. So my border needs to be cut 40 1/4. Slightly smaller than what the book says it needs to be. So I am going to cut my strips at 40 1/4, and I'm going to do it just like we did last time, but they're going to be folded in half. So I'm going to use half that measurement. So I'm going to cut mine at 20 1/8 with the fold on the 1 mark. let's go ahead and do that. So I'm 20 1/8. I'm going to lay my fold on my mat here and go down here nice and smoothly to 20 1/8. And I'm going to cut both strips. Pretty easy to do. We just lay our 1/8 inch line on there just like that. So that is border 1. Let's do the second one. Make sure it's all lined up. And we'll cut that. All right. So now we have our 2 border prints. But we can't just go and sew them to the quilt because we have another step. Remember, we now have the border print that's going to take us to the edge of here, but we have to add those cornerstones. So we're going to take our 4 4.5 inch cornerstones, and we're going to sew one of these cornerstones to either side, both sides basically, of the strip. So here are the 2 that go on this end, and then we're going to put the other 2 down on this end. And once we get those 2 pieces sewn to the end of the border, then we can press. And I pressed my seams out towards the border, so now I'm going to have to press this seam in towards the border so that the 2 seams here will lock. And then I'm going to pin it from the top and the bottom. This time I'm going to pin from the seam here first, then out, and from the seam there first, and then out, and then I'm going to do the walking thing. Okay, friends, we've sewn our border prints and my cornerstones to the ends of my border, so we're going to go ahead and pin those and get those in place. And as I was mentioning, so I had pressed my seams out towards the border, so when I put my cornerstones on my border print, I also pressed the seam to the border, and that should make those 2 seams nest when we go to put them together, okay? So that's what I meant by pressing to the border. So I'm going to go ahead and nest. When I start this, I'm going to nest those 2 seams because I want those 2 seams to go together properly. And then I'm going to pin this corner. You can see. And they should fit perfectly because they're both the same width. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side before I pin anything else, making sure this is nice and straight and not twisted. We'll go down to this end and we're going to do exactly the same thing. So we'll pin right here where the 2 seams need to nest. If I can get them to nest. There we go. All right. And then right here at the corner. All right, so now that I have those 2 ends right here, when I lay this out, I ought to be able to get it all in the frame. Okay, and then we're going to do exactly the same thing that we did last time. So we're going to take this corner, and we're just going to kind of stretch it out. And this one's nice and flat. We're going to walk it down, stop in our center, pull this up to where it needs to be. And this one's going to go on really, really nicely because we didn't have to average anything. All of the measurements fit. Okay. And then in this case, I'm hoping you can see this. So I might have to get the camera in a little closer. So in between these 2 pins. So right here in between the 2 pins, everything is laid nice and flat. But you can see where my border strip is right along the block here. And sort of right along the block here, but I have this bit that's hanging over. So I have to be really careful of that because if I were to align the border up to the black, when I turned it over, I have like a spot here where I could potentially not catch. So it's just a little bit uneven, and that will happen on your quilt, and I was going to fix it, but I thought it would be much more important to show you on this video. So if I walk my fingers through with the pins, I'm going to pin here, but I'm actually going to make sure that my border is actually aligned with this blue strip here. And I can see that they're perfectly aligned. And then I'm not going to worry about this little black too much. then I can see here where they're aligned perfectly. So I'm just going to have this little bit of dip right here between these other two blocks. So you can actually pin here to make sure this stays really nice. And you can pin on this side, and you can see where it just sort of starts to go off skew here. And that way, I'm just going to follow the edge of this border, and it's just going to take a slightly bigger bite on this black, and it'll be fine, but it'll even things out really nicely. And that does happen. So if you have a situation where that happens, just make sure that your border print is aligned with the narrowest part, I guess you would say, okay? And then we'll continue the process here. It may happen again. I don't think it is, but maybe just a little bit. So we can move our border print up along here, and we can pin in the center, and it's really like a minute amount right here that you can see. And I'm not as worried about that. I think this is a nice straight line, and we're not going to have too much overhang in play. But if you're worried about it, if it's a little uneven, you can always pin so that you can hold this in its place and it doesn't shift. And that way, when you're sewing these really, really long seams, you don't miss the fabric underneath. I'm hoping that makes total sense, because a lot of times what will happen is a quilter will get all the way to the end of the border, and they've missed catching it underneath where they can't see because you're laying the two layers together. And this is the result. This is the reason it does that, because it gets a little bit out of skew while you're sewing, and you think you're stitching that 1/4 of an inch seam just perfect, and when you look on the other side, you didn't catch it. So it's really important, if you think things might shift, you just go ahead and stick a pin in it. It's totally fine to put a pin in it, and it'll hold it to keep it from shifting, and then you just have to pay attention to that when you're stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and pin the second border on in the exact same manner, and then we'll stitch it and come back and see what we've got. Okay, everyone, so I finished all of the borders. We've got our beautiful little butterflies and our cornerstones. Everything matches really nicely. It looks lovely. And we got our quilt top finished for our original quilt. And I think that's awesome. I'm so excited. I hope that you just finished your awesome quilt. Now, what I'm going to do next is we're going to up our game just a little bit, and we're going to cut the borders for the quilt underneath, because remember, we have this 3x4 quilt that we have underneath that we have to cut borders for. So we're going to go ahead and measure those. So in the event you want to expand your quilt just a little bit, or in the case of a lot of my beginner students from the previous class, they went and made the quilt again in a slightly larger size just to reinforce those skills that we learned. So let's go ahead and put the borders on the second quilt. So here we have our 3x4, and now that we've sewn all our rows together, you can kind of see that bottom row here. So this one, 3x4, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to add the borders to the top and the bottom, because as we know before, we know that this quilt width-wise will fit in one strip, selvage to selvage, of fabric, one width of fabric strip. So we're going to go ahead and measure through the quilt so that we know exactly what size to cut our strip, so we can put our border strip on the quilt. So let me go ahead and do that. So now that we're cutting our strips, we're not really sure how many strips to cut of this particular border. And before, we did things a little differently before, but remember, we're putting cornerstones on this quilt, so we actually do know, now that we know that we are going to cut one set of strips at 40.5, we can actually measure through the length of this quilt now too, because of the cornerstones. Again, if we were just putting border around the outside, we would put a border on the top of the bottom, and then we would have a fully new length measurement that would include the top and the bottom border, but we're using those cornerstones. So we can actually already measure through the length of the quilt, and we're going to do that this time. We're going to do it that way because we need to know how many strips we actually need to cut. So let's go ahead and measure through the length, 54.5. So we have a quilt that is 54.5 inches long. So we can go ahead and cut those strips, but our fabric strips are not 54.5 inches long. So we have to make some decisions here. We're gonna have to add another strip. So I wanted to go ahead and calculate that out because we're about to cut our borders. And then I'm also gonna make a note because I don't wanna mess up. So I'm actually just gonna put it right here in my phone because my phone's right next to me, but you could do it with a piece of paper and a pencil. And all I'm gonna do is say that I need my upper and lower borders at 40.5 and I need my bottom borders at 54.5 because I had to remember that, and then we'll go ahead and cut. So let's go back to cutting our strips. So now I have my 5 strips. My other leftover piece of fabric is going away. Out here on the counter, I'm gonna lay, so here are my 2 strips for the top and bottom. Here are 2 strips for the side. And I have 1 extra strip. And this strip, I'm just going to cut in half. And I'm gonna do that with my ruler. I'm just gonna open it up to its center fold line. And I'm just gonna take my rotary cutter and just cut right there in half. Make a nice little square line right there, okay? And then each of those halves goes here. So I'm gonna cut off the selvage on my border strips, sew my raw end to the end of it, and then we'll cut that to size. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So there are my top and bottom borders. And now we've got our, or my 2 side borders is what there's gonna be. So our top and bottom borders are gonna need to be cut. So now we've got our top and bottom borders, and I can go ahead and add my top and bottom borders to this quilt top, and then we'll come back and we'll work on the side borders. All right, we have added our single border to the top and the bottom, although you can't see it because it's out of camera, to the bottom of this quilt, and we're gonna go ahead and add our sides. So let's do that first. So I have my short piece here with the selvage on it. This is the part that I cut in half. So I'm just gonna come over here. Selvages are now here on my right, and with a square off end, oops, I'm just gonna cut the selvage right off of the fabric. So now I have an end here, a piece of fabric that is half the width of fabric, and it has no selvages on it. And I'm gonna do the same thing to this border. Now this border is folded in half, so I'm cutting both selvages off at the same time, a little bit. There we go. So we don't need those. Now we're gonna open this border up, and the first thing that we're going to do is take this border side and this border side, like that, and I'm gonna lay it together and stitch it on a straight seam so that I have a much longer strip. And I'm gonna do the same thing now that I'm going to the sewing machine with this part. And then I'm gonna go sew them together, and then I'm going to measure them and cut them to size before I add the 2 outer cornerstones, okay? All right, my strips are sewn together. Let's take a look on the table. Now we're going to fold them together and cut them. So wanted to show you that when I sewed the 2 pieces together, I opened the seam. That's going to reduce a bulk a little bit. And I'm going to lay my 2 cut ends together, nice and even. And I'm going to put all my sides together, nice and even, all the way down to the fold, okay? And I can turn this over. I'm only doing that so I can make sure that my sewn end is even. So see how I'm getting all of the sides, the edges, even in a nice straight line, okay? So now that I have that, I'm gonna take my strip here and I'm gonna lay my fold. We'll move it up so you can see it a little bit better. I'm gonna lay this fold right here on the 0 mark, keeping my borders very straight right up against the line on the edge here and my ends. So now I have a completely folded in half border print. And then I said that let me check my notes, was 54 and a half. 54 and a half. So I need to cut my strips here at 27 and a quarter, which is half of 54 and a half. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to grab my ruler. So we're going to do the same thing to the other strip. Okay. My two little end scraps here, and my border is now perfectly sized. So now I can take my two border strips and I can add my 4.5 inch squares that I cut of my same fabric here, and I can add those to each end of my long strip. And then I'm going to do exactly what I did with the shorter quilt. So I'm going to pin at the seam, and we're going to pin at the seam and the end, the seam and the end, and then walk our fingers through the middle. So it's going to be exactly the same technique. We might need a longer table, so I probably can't do it on camera, but we can add those borders to the quilt. So let's go do that. All right, well, we have finished, and believe it or not, during this lesson, we have finished 2 tops. So we put the border on our much bigger quilt. I think our big quilt turned out lovely. I did do the same border here as I did in this block. So there is, because of that, there is a super focus on the sort of plus sign of the blocks in the center versus having that 5 patch that we have in the black and beige quilt that I just folded up over there. So, but in any case, we are done. So if you've been following along with this class, congratulations on making your first quilt top or your first class top or whatever if you're starting at the very beginning. And if not, congratulations on making this quilt. So we've made the top. What's next? So in lesson 8, we have 3 more lessons basically left to this quilt. And in lesson 8, what we're going to do is put our quilt sandwich together. So we're going to get our backing and our batting and put that together. And I'm going to tell you the tools you're going to need to do that. In lesson 9, we're actually going to quilt it. We're going to put quilting stitches through it. I'm going to work on the smaller one rather than the bigger one, but we're going to get the quilting done. And in lesson 10, we're going to get the binding done. And then once the binding is done, we can put a label on the quilt. That'll probably be a little extra that I'll do afterwards. But once our binding is done, our quilt is finished, and it can be used and washed and loved and gifted if that's what you so choose. So we have 3 more lessons left. I'll try to get them done in a very timely manner at Pat's suggestion. So Pat says for the backing, you're going to have, your backing should be 2.5 yards of fabric, and you're going to need a rectangle that's 40.5 by 53. I'm guessing that's width of fabric by 53. And then a strip that is width of fabric by 13.5, and then a 13.5 inch square. And if you look over here on our page, this diagram shows you exactly how those 3 pieces need to be sewn together. And you cut yourself a strip and a square. You can sew the strip and square together, sew them to the side of the rectangle, and that should give you a big enough backing with 2.5 yards. So lesson number 8, we're gonna have our backing ready, and we're gonna create our quilt sandwich. And until next time, enjoy the glory of making your own quilt. Check us out on the web, cabinquilters.com, or you can head over to YouTube at Cabin Quilters, youtube.com/cabinquilters, and find all kinds of other interesting videos that you can watch on the same topic. All right, and until next time, I'll see you in the next one.